The summer of 2003 marked an unprecedented natural disaster across Europe. The heatwave that would go down in history as one of the most severe and deadly heat events the continent had ever experienced. Temperatures soared to extreme levels, reaching more than 40 degrees Celsius in many areas, and in some places the heat persisted for days on end. The heat wave was particularly harsh in countries like France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, where the high temperatures were not only record-breaking, but also relentlessly persistent. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary summer heat, this was a crisis, one that would claim more than 70,000 lives across Europe. In France, the impact of the heat wave was especially severe. The country's typical mild summers were no match for the scorching temperatures that engulfed the nation. Cities like Paris, known for their pleasant summer weather, found themselves under a relentless heat dome, with temperatures rising well above 40 degrees Celsius for multiple days in a row. In fact, the highest temperature ever recorded in France at the time, 44.1 degrees Celsius, was a shocking reminder of just how extreme the heat had become. This sudden and extreme shift in weather took many people by surprise. Unlike other parts of the world, France was not equipped to handle such intense heat, especially in residential areas where central air conditioning was rare. The heat wave in France did more than just make the air unbearably hot. It brought health risks that many were unprepared for. Dehydration, heat stroke, and heat-related illnesses surged, particularly among the elderly and young children. With hospitals quickly overwhelmed, it became clear that the French health system was not prepared for an event of this magnitude. The death toll from this heat wave in France alone reached over 14,000, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's history. But France was not the only country feeling the heat. Across southern Europe, the effects were widespread and devastating. In Spain and Portugal, the heat wave led to similarly catastrophic outcomes. Temperatures soared to near 50 degrees Celsius in parts of Spain, and the combination of intense heat and drought created the perfect conditions for wildfires. These fires ravaged forests, destroyed homes, and took lives. In Portugal, nearly 2,000 people died due to the heat, with rural areas bearing the brunt of the damage. The situation was worsened by freak storms that swept through the southern regions, further increasing the danger and disrupting already fragile infrastructures. Even the typically cooler northern parts of Spain were not spared, as temperatures soared to levels never before seen, breaking decades-old records. The heat wave was not just a weather event, it was a major public health emergency that exposed the lack of preparedness across many countries in Europe. Most of these nations had not considered such extreme heat to be a serious threat, as their climates were not typically prone to such high temperatures. For instance, in the United Kingdom, temperatures reached an all-time high of 38.5 degrees Celsius. While this may not sound as extreme compared to other countries, it was the highest temperature ever recorded in the UK at the time. The heat put immense pressure on healthcare systems, utilities, and governments, all of which scrambled to cope with the health crisis and infrastructural challenges posed by the relentless heat. As this intense period of heat continued into August, it became clear that the impact was far-reaching. The severe temperatures were exacerbated by the urban heat island effect, particularly in large cities like Paris. The heat island effect occurs when cities, with their buildings, roads, and limited greenery, trap and retain heat, making them even hotter than surrounding rural areas. This made it difficult for residents to escape the oppressive heat, particularly at night when temperatures remained high, providing little relief. The European heat wave of 2003 not only tested the resilience of communities, but also highlighted the need for urgent changes in how countries handle extreme weather events. The health consequences were just the beginning. What was happening across Europe was a preview of the kind of climate challenges that the future might hold if action wasn't taken to prepare and adapt. But at the time, no one could have predicted just how far-reaching the effects would be. As Europe baked under the scorching sun, the true magnitude of the disaster began to unfold, setting the stage for the even more devastating days to come. As the heat wave stretched into August, it became clear that the conditions were far from ordinary. The combination of high-pressure systems and persistent southerly winds from the Sahara Desert resulted in a relentless wave of heat across Europe. This heat was not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. The conditions were so extreme that many regions were breaking temperature records that had stood for decades. In France, for example, the temperature reached an astonishing 44.1 degrees Celsius, which was the highest temperature ever recorded in the country. This extreme heat became a serious health risk for many, especially the elderly, young children, and those with pre-existing health conditions. For countries like France, where the summers were typically mild, this sudden surge in temperatures caused a major public health crisis. In many areas, people simply weren't prepared for this kind of heat. Air conditioning was not common in most homes, particularly in the northern regions of France, where summers were rarely this hot. As a result, many people had no way to cool down, making them vulnerable to heat-related illnesses like heat stroke and dehydration. The situation was worsened by the urban heat island effect, where cities, with their dense concrete and asphalt, absorbed and retained heat more than rural areas, making the temperatures in cities even hotter. The heat wave in France led to over 14,000 heat-related deaths, with most of the victims being elderly people who were unable to cope with the extreme heat. The situation was dire, and as temperatures climbed higher, hospitals and emergency services found themselves overwhelmed with people suffering from heat-related illnesses. This strain on the health system delayed treatments, which only added to the death toll. In some places, the government took action, setting up helplines for concerned citizens and providing information on how to stay cool and hydrated, but by then the damage had already been done. In Portugal, the heat wave was equally catastrophic. A combination of high temperatures and dry conditions led to widespread wildfires, with the intense heat fanning the flames and making them harder to control. The record-breaking temperatures, with nighttime lows still above 30 degrees Celsius, caused further stress on both people and infrastructure. In addition to the human toll, the agricultural sector also took a massive hit. The drought created crop shortages affecting food production across the region. The damage to agriculture led to long-term economic consequences, and as the heat wave raged on, the consequences of the extreme weather became painfully clear. Across Europe, the heat wave was leaving its mark not just in the form of heat-related deaths, but also in terms of the damage to infrastructure. Many countries experienced power outages as the demand for electricity soared, with air conditioning units working overtime to try and keep buildings cool. The strain on power grids was intense, and the infrastructure, in many areas, was simply not built to handle this level of demand. The agricultural sector was not the only one affected. Water shortages also became an issue as rivers and lakes, which were crucial sources of water for both drinking and irrigation, began to dry up. These extreme conditions, however, were not limited to just one or two countries. The heat wave spread across much of Europe, with countries like Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany also experiencing devastating heat and drought. The Netherlands, for instance, recorded temperatures as high as 37.8 degrees Celsius. This was close to the national record, which had stood for more than a century. This unusual heat was felt in both urban and rural areas, and just like in other affected countries, the elderly were particularly vulnerable. While the heat wave did not break records in every country, the intensity and length of the event were unprecedented in most places. In Germany, the heat caused severe disruptions in shipping on the Elbe and Danube rivers. Low water levels, a result of the ongoing drought, made it difficult for ships to navigate. This not only impacted transportation, but also affected the economy, as fewer goods could be moved via these critical waterways. Similarly, power plants in countries like Germany had to reduce their output due to the high water temperatures in rivers, which made it unsafe to cool their reactors. With the combination of heat and drought affecting so many sectors, the broader economic impact was becoming undeniable. As the temperatures stayed high and the situation worsened, it was becoming clearer that the aftermath of the heat wave would be felt long after the weather returned to normal. The 2003 heat wave was not just a summer event, it marked a turning point in how Europe would approach extreme weather. It revealed how vulnerable many countries were to such events and exposed the gaps in public health systems, emergency preparedness, and infrastructure. The intense heat, the health risks, and the economic toll made it clear that something needed to be done to prevent or mitigate future disasters. As the heat wave continued to ravage Europe, it became apparent that the extreme weather was having a profound effect on the environment. Forests, fields, and farmlands, which were already under strain from the lack of rainfall, were now facing the additional burden of record-high temperatures. The drought was especially devastating for crops, and the effects were felt across much of the agricultural sector. In countries like Spain and Italy, where agriculture is a key part of the economy, the consequences were immediate. Fields of wheat, corn, and olives dried up, and many farmers faced the tragic reality of losing their harvests. The economic toll was significant, with billions of euros in damages across Europe's agricultural industry. The heat wave also led to an increased risk of wildfires. With the combination of dry vegetation and high winds, The stage was set for catastrophic fires to break out. In Portugal, the situation became dire as fires spread rapidly across the country, fueled by the dry conditions and intense heat. The fires threatened both rural and urban areas, and thousands of people had to be evacuated from their homes to avoid being trapped by the flames. The firefighting efforts were complicated by the extreme heat, making it harder to control the fires and protect homes and infrastructure. Portugal was not alone in facing these dangers. In Spain, Italy, and France, wildfires broke out as well, leading to further evacuations and destruction of property. The fires not only claimed lives, but also caused significant damage to the natural environment, with vast areas of forest and wildlife habitats being destroyed. Wildlife was another group that suffered severely during the heat wave. The drought reduced the availability of food and water for many species, forcing animals to seek out new areas for survival. In some regions, animals were found wandering in urban areas searching for water. The heat also put stress on aquatic life, with rivers, lakes, and streams drying up or reaching dangerously low levels. Fish and other aquatic species were at risk due to the increase in water temperature, which led to oxygen depletion in some bodies of water. The delicate balance of ecosystems across Europe was disturbed, and many experts warned that the long-term effects on biodiversity could be severe if such heat waves became more frequent. The situation was further complicated by the human response to the heat. As temperatures soared, many people took to rivers and lakes in an attempt to cool down, only to find that these bodies of water were already dangerously low. The lack of water made it harder for people to stay hydrated, which only contributed to the rise in heat-related illnesses. Hospitals continued to be overwhelmed, and while many governments provided resources to assist the public, the scale of the crisis made it difficult to address every need. Additionally, the heat wave had significant long-term consequences for Europe's infrastructure. As the ground dried out, the earth beneath roads and buildings shifted, causing cracks and structural damage. Railway tracks were especially vulnerable, with some sections buckling under the extreme heat, disrupting travel. The heat caused concrete to crack and asphalt to soften, leading to delays and safety concerns on the roads. Airports in many regions experienced delays as ground crews struggled to deal with the heat, and air travel became less reliable. The cost of repairing the damage to infrastructure was enormous, and many European countries found themselves facing bills that stretched into the billions. The economic losses did not end with agriculture and infrastructure. The heat wave caused significant problems for the tourism industry as well. In countries like France and Italy, where tourism is a major part of the economy, travelers stayed away due to the unbearable heat. Resort areas and historical sites saw fewer visitors, and many outdoor events were canceled due to the risk of heat-related health problems. On the flip side, there was a rise in demand for air conditioning and cooling systems, leading to a spike in sales, but this only added to the strain on power grids. Perhaps one of the most sobering outcomes of the 2003 heat wave was the realization that climate change could be a driving force behind such extreme events. Scientists and climate experts began to warn that as global temperatures continued to rise, Europe could expect more frequent and severe heat waves in the coming decades. This prompted governments across the continent to take a closer look at their climate policies and disaster preparedness plans. While the heat wave eventually subsided, the lessons learned from this disaster were far from forgotten. European governments began to implement measures aimed at mitigating the impacts of extreme weather, including heat action plans, better urban planning to prevent the urban heat island effect, and investments in green technologies. The aftermath of the 2003 heat wave highlighted the vulnerability of Europe to extreme weather events and underscored the importance of both local and global efforts to combat climate change. The severity of the heat, its economic consequences, and the toll it took on human and animal life left a lasting impact. It was no longer a question of whether such events would happen again, but rather, when. The heat wave in its wake set the stage for greater awareness of climate risks and the urgent need for adaptation strategies to protect both people and the planet from the intensifying impacts of climate change. As the years passed after the intense heat wave of 2003, Europe began to adapt to the rising threat of extreme weather. The lessons learned from that summer would inform a series of responses aimed at minimizing the impacts of future climate events. One of the most significant changes was in the way cities approached urban planning and environmental sustainability. In the wake of the heat wave, many European cities began to incorporate more green spaces into their urban landscapes. By creating parks, rooftop gardens, and increasing tree cover, cities hope to reduce the urban heat island effect, which causes cities to be much warmer than surrounding rural areas due to the dense concentration of buildings and human activity. Many governments also took steps to improve early warning systems for extreme weather. Heat waves, which had previously been seen as occasional anomalies, were now recognized as potentially life-threatening events. Across Europe, national meteorological services worked to enhance their forecasting abilities, while health departments developed heat action plans to protect vulnerable populations. In some countries, special measures were introduced to ensure that elderly people and those with pre-existing health conditions had access to cooling centers and could avoid the dangerous heat. Hospitals also ramped up preparedness to manage heat-related illnesses, including heat stroke and dehydration. In addition to heat-related precautions, there was a growing emphasis on reducing carbon emissions to combat climate change. Following the extreme heat of 2003, the European Union and its member states intensified their efforts to meet climate goals, aiming to limit global warming. Renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power began to receive more attention and investment, with the EU setting ambitious targets for reducing carbon footprints. The development of energy-efficient technologies and the promotion of public transportation helped decrease reliance on fossil fuels, which contributed to both global warming and the frequency of extreme weather events. Farmers, too, took action in response to the harsh conditions that had devastated crops during the heat wave. In countries where agriculture was a key industry, new farming techniques were introduced to help adapt to changing climate conditions. Drought-resistant crops were developed and tested, and irrigation systems were upgraded to conserve water. Additionally, many farmers invested in technologies to monitor weather patterns and soil moisture levels, which helped them make more informed decisions about planting and harvesting. These measures aimed to increase resilience and ensure that European agriculture could survive and thrive, even in the face of increasing climate uncertainty. Despite these efforts, the memory of the heat wave remained vivid, and many were still grappling with the lingering effects. Water shortages were a continuous concern, and many regions began to explore new methods for water conservation and management. The drought conditions, which had plagued large parts of Europe in 2003, had become an ongoing challenge. Countries began to invest in desalination plants and other water-saving technologies to ensure that they could meet the growing demands of both their populations and their agricultural sectors. As the climate continued to change, the conversation around heat waves and extreme weather shifted from being about recovery to being about preparation. No longer were such events seen as rare occurrences, but rather as inevitable risks that needed to be planned for. Governments focused not just on reducing the immediate damage caused by heat waves, but on developing long-term strategies for climate adaptation. This included improving the resilience of infrastructure, investing in renewable energy, and enhancing public health systems to deal with the ongoing threats posed by extreme weather. While the heat wave of 2003 had been an unprecedented event, it was no longer an isolated incident. In the years that followed, other European countries experienced similarly devastating heat waves, leading to the realization that climate change was not just a future threat, it was already here. The lesson of the heat wave was clear: extreme weather events, fueled by rising global temperatures, would only become more frequent and intense, and it was up to governments, businesses, and individuals to prepare for the inevitable. In conclusion, the heat wave of 2003 served as a wake-up call for Europe. It forced the continent to confront the reality of climate change and the profound impact that extreme weather can have on human life, ecosystems, and economies. The widespread devastation it caused in terms of loss of life, crop failure, wildfires, and infrastructure damage was a turning point in how Europe understood its vulnerability to climate change. The steps taken in the aftermath of the heat wave, from changes in urban planning to the promotion of renewable energy, set the foundation for a more resilient Europe. While the long-term consequences of climate change remain uncertain, the lessons from that summer continue to guide efforts to protect the planet and its people from the increasing threat of extreme weather.